your host. Right, so everybody knows that during this time, both world wars happened, because you might see them in the movies. But do you really know what happened before or after and its consequences? As well, what other human achievements happened, or who were the people that impacted the century? So we're going to start in 1902, when Cuba gained independence of US. This is the root of the problem between both nations. On the other side, in Asia, 2 years later, the Russo-Japanese War started. This is the war that the Russians decided not to mention since they lost against Japan under the reign of Nicholas II. This made the tension to rise, and with that led to the Russian Revolution in 1905, in which it established the Duma and a new constitution. Following this revolution, in 1908, there was the Young-Turk Revolution in the Ottoman Empire, which made possible the restoration of the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. And just 9 years later, in 1917, the Mexican Constitution was proclaimed by Carranza in Querétaro after Pancho Villa, a revolutionary leader, made a front against him. There is another Russian revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, who established the first Marxist country and united Russia to start the Soviet Union. During the revolution and the attempt to remove the Tsar from the power in 1914, the whole Romanov family was assassinated. Another conflict that started in 1914 and involved a lot of countries was the First World War, which was detonated with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria by a Yugoslav. In this war, there were two major powers, the Axis confirmed by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, while Russia, France, and Great Britain were the Entente. By that time, India was under the British rule. Since 1760, Britain gained in political and economical power over India, and years later, India began to resent being ruled by a foreign government. As a result, India's independent movement started. By 1919, Indians were upset with the British rule, so they met to protest outside a temple in Amritsar. Unfortunately, Britain responded to this act, and the British soldiers began to shoot a group of them. Gandhi, a man who devoted his life fighting for the equality of all, called for Indian independence and launched a peace non-cooperation movement against the British rule in 1920, achieving his goal in 1947 as India and Pakistan gained independence from British rule. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1948 because of his concern for Muslims, as he was an Hindu. After the defeat of the Axis in World War I, at the start of the Great Depression, a lot of changes happened in politics, with this regarding the start of totalitarian leaders such as Mussolini, who became Italy's prime minister in 1922. Even though the Great Depression was mostly happening in Europe, other countries were also affected, and with these new ideas and changes came to place. For example, the start of Guerra Cristera in Mexico was due to eradicate the power of the church in the government with the lead of President Lázaro Cárdenas. After the Great Depression, another major war which had an impact all over the world took place. This war was World War II. This war lasted from 1939 to 1945, and it involved the vast majority of the world's nations, including all of the great powers. It all began in 1933, when the Nazi leaders Hitler appointed German Chancellor, and Nazi began organized persecution of Jews. There are many causes of this war, including the weakening of the League of Nations since Italy withdrew from it in 1937. As part of the Second World War and the never-ending problems between China and Japan broke out into a war at the same time, the rising of the Chinese nationalism. In the same way, Japan and US had tensions between them. This started with the bombing of the naval base in Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, directed by Hideaki Toho, followed by the throwing of atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were developed by the German scientist Albert Einstein, ordered by the American President Harry Truman, that marked the end of this war. He later, in 1950, made orders to develop the hydrogen bomb. Ending the Second World War, in 1945, Hitler escapes and commits suicide. At least this is what is thought, as they never found his body. As a result of the war, another conflict arose from it, the Cold War. announcing the beginning of it. Winston Churchill became the Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1940, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech because of the division of Europe in East and West. The Cold War consists in a war of knowledge and power between the US and the USSR. During this time, US was undergoing a lot of changes, especially with the civil rights movement, where we have Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, in 1963, in which he calls for an end of racism in the United States and called for civil and economic rights. Some of the consequences of the Cold War was the division of East and West Berlin, with the Berlin Wall that fell 28 years later after its construction, in 1981, after continuous strikes that lasted for days until the wall was opened. In 1968, the Tlatelolco massacre took place in Mexico after continuous strike by students, teachers, and social workers, but they were stopped by government orders, causing the death of around 300 people. 2 years later, President Richard Nixon declared to a television that the American military troops, accompanied by the South Vietnamese People's Army, were about to invade Cambodia. The pretext for the invasion was disturbing the North Vietnamese supply lines and bomb and destroy the Viet Cong base camps that were backing up other operations in South Vietnam. In 1978, the President of the US, Jimmy Carter, signed the agreement to hand over the Panama Canal to Panama, after having it for 85 years. In the same year, John Paul II became Pope, and just 3 years later, in 1981, the Pope was shot and wounded by Mehem Ali Al-Qad while he was entering in the square. Incredibly, the Pope later forgave him for the attempt. The Cold War was finally ended in 1990, when the US and the USSR negotiated arms accords. Then, in 1991, the Central Asian states declared independence, and in the same year the Soviet Union dissolves. And a year later, in 1992, the European Union, a political-economic union of 20 member states located primarily in Europe, was created. In 1993, under Bill Clinton's rule, the World Trade Center was bombed. It was the first terrorist attack of the World Trade Center carried out on February 26 of 1993, when a truck bomb was detonated below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. In 1994, in North Korea, Kim Jong-il assumed control of North Korea, and a year later, North Korea famine began.